Let's get started. You notice that I do have some of my nails painted, just these 5. Then next time I'll do these 5. Anyway, here we are. Okay. So, tell me about this new person, said Will, as the 3 of them settled comfortably by the fire, steaming mugs of herb tea warming their cupped hands. McNeil, Horace corrected him. He's a legend. Oh, he's real enough, said Gillen. I should know. I practiced under him for 5 years. I started when I was 11. Then, at 14, I was apprenticed to Holt, but he always gave me leave of absence to continue my work with the swordsmaster. But why did you continue to learn the sword after you started training as a ranger? Horace asked. Gillen shrugged. Maybe people thought it was a shame to waste all the early training. I certainly wanted to continue, and my father is Sir David of Carway Fief, so I suppose I was given some leeway in the matter. Horace sat up a little straighter at the mention of the name. Battlemaster David, he said, obviously more than a little impressed. The new Supreme Commander. Gillen nodded, smiling at the boy's enthusiasm. The same, he agreed. Then, seeing that Will was still in the dark, he explained further. My father has been appointed Supreme Commander of the Knights' armies since Lord Northlet was murdered. He commanded the cavalry at the Battle of Hackham Heath. Will's eyes widened. When Mortark was defeated and driven into the mountains. Both Horace and Gillen nodded. Horace continued the explanation enthusiastically. Sir Rodney says his coordination of the cavalry with flanking archers in the final stage of the battle is a classic of its kind. He still teaches it as an example of perfect tactic. No wonder your father was chosen to replace Lord Northlet. We realized that the conversation had moved away from its original gambit. So what did your father have to do with this McNeil character? He asked, returning to the subject. Well, said Gillen, my father was a former pupil as well. It was only natural that McNeil should gravitate to his battle school, wasn't it? I suppose so, Will agreed, and it was only natural that I should come under his tutelage as soon as I could swing a sword. After all, I was the battlemaster's son. So how was it that you became a ranger? Horace asked. Weren't you accepted as a knight? Both rangers looked at him quizzically, somewhat amused by his assumption that a person only became a ranger after failing to become a knight or a warrior. In turn, it was only a short time since Will had felt the same way, but now he conveniently overlooked the fact. Horace became aware of the extended lull in the conversation, then of the looks they were giving him. All of a sudden, he realized his gaffe and tried to recover. I mean, most of us want to be knights, don't we? Will and Gil exchanged glances. Gillen raised an eyebrow. Horace responded on. I mean, no offense or anything, but everyone I know wanted to be a warrior. His embarrassment lessened as he pointed a forefinger at Will. You did yourself, Will. I remember when we were kids, you used to always say you were going to battle school and you'd be a famous knight. Now it was Will's turn to feel uncomfortable. And you always sneered at me, didn't you? And said I'd be too small, he said. Well, you were, said Horace with some heat. Is that right? Will replied angrily. Well, does it occur to you that maybe Holt had already spoken to Sir Bromley and said he wanted me as an apprentice, and that's the reason why I wasn't selected for battle school? Holt, has that ever occurred to you? Gillen interrupted at this point, gently stopping the argument before it got any further out of hand. I think that's enough of childhood squabbles, he said firmly. Both boys, each ready with another verbal barbs, subsided a little awkwardly. Oh, yes, right, mumbled Will. Sorry. Horace nodded several times, embarrassed at the petty scene that had just occurred. Me too, he said. Then curiously piked. he added. Is that how it happened, Will? Did Holt tell Cerberus not to pick you because he wanted you for a ranger? Will dropped his gaze and picked at a loose thread on his shirt. Well, not exactly, he said, then admitted, and you're right, I always did want to be a knight when I was a kid. Then turning quickly to Gillen, he added, but I wouldn't change it now, not for anything. Gillen smiled at the two of them. I was opposite, he said. Remember? I grew up in the battle school. I may have had started my training with McNeil when I was 11, but I began my basic training at around 9. That must have been wonderful, Horace said with a sigh. Surprisingly, Gillen shook his head. Not to me. You know what they say about distant pastures always look greener. Both boys looked puzzled by this. It means you always want what you haven't got, he said, and they both nodded their understanding. Well, that's the way I was. By the time I was 12, I was sick to death of the discipline and drills and parades. He glanced sidelong at Horace. There's a bit of that goes on in battle school, you know. They have the heavy-set boys sighed. You're telling me, he agreed. Still, the horsemanship and practice combats are fun. Maybe, said Gillen, but I was more interested in the life the Rangers led. After Hackham Heath, my father and Holt had become good friends, and Holt used to come visiting. I'd see him come and go, so mysterious, so adventurous. I started to think what it might be like to come and go as you please, to live in the forest. People know so little about rangers. It seemed like the most exciting thing in the world to me. Horace looked doubtful. I've always been a little scared of Holt, he said. I used to think he was some kind of sorcerer. Will snorted in disbelief. Holt? A sorcerer, he said. He's nothing of the kind. Horace looked at him, pained once again. But you used to think the same thing, he said. Well, I suppose so, but I was only a kid then. So was I, replied Horace with devastating logic. Gillen grinned at the two of them. They were both still boys. Holt had been right. He thought it was good for Will to be spending some time in company with someone his own age. Will turned to the older ranger. So did you ask Holt to take you as an apprentice? He asked. Then, before receiving any answer, continued, What did he say to that? Gillen shook his head. I didn't ask him anything. I followed him, and one day, when he left our castle and headed into the forest. You followed him, a ranger. You followed a ranger into the forest, said Horace. He didn't know whether to be impressed by Gillen's courage or appalled at his foolishness. Will sprang to Gillen's defense. Gil's one of the best unseen movers in the Ranger Corps, he said quickly. The best, probably. I wasn't then, said Gillen ruefully. Mind you, I thought I knew a bit about moving without being seen. I found out how little I actually did know when I tried to sneak up on Holt as he stopped for a noon meal. First thing I knew was his hand grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and threw me in the stream. He smiled at the memory of it. I suppose he sent you home in disgrace then? Asked Horace, but Gillen shook his head again, a distant smile still on his face as he remembered that day. On the contrary, he kept me with him for a week, said I wasn't too bad at sneaking around the forest, and I might have some talent as an unseen mover. He started to teach me about being a ranger, and by the end of the week I was his apprentice. How did your father take it when you told him? Will asked. Surely he wanted you to be a knight like him. I guess he was disappointed. Not at all, said Gillen. The strange thing was, Holt had told him that I'd probably be following him into the forest. My father had already agreed that I could serve as Holt's apprentice before I even knew I wanted to. Horace frowned. How could Holt have known that? Gillen shrugged and looked at Will meaningfully. Holt has a way of knowing things, doesn't he, Will? He asked, grinning. Will remembered that dark night in the Baron's office and the hand that had shot out of the darkness to seize his wrist. Holt had been waiting waiting for him that night, just he'd obviously waited for Gillen to follow him. He looked deep into the low embers of the fire before he answered. Maybe in his own way he is a kind of a sorcerer, he said. The three companions sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, thinking about what had been discussed. Then Gillen stretched and yawned. Well, I'm for sleep, he said. We're on a war footing these days, so we'll set watches. Will, you're first, then Horace, then me. Not you two. And as saying, he rolled himself into his grey-green cloak and was soon breathing deeply and evenly. Okay, well, thank you for listening to me read chapter 4. If you'd like to listen to me read chapter 5, then please stay tuned. Thank you. Bye-bye.